I'm Charlie, I'm a psychotherapist, and today we're going to be reacting to Good Will Hunting. I have seen this film a long time ago, but today we're going to be reacting and looking at whether it's realistic or not in terms of what actually happens in real life in therapy versus what happens in a movie. So let's press play and see what we're dealing with.
What is that?
This is your file. I have to send it back to the judge for evaluation.
Oh. Hey, you're not gonna fail me, are you? What's it say?
You want to read it?
Why? Have you had any, experience with that?
20 years of counseling. Yeah, I've seen some pretty awful shit.
I mean, have you had any experience with that?
Personally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have.
Sure ain't good.
My father was an alcoholic. Mean fucking drunk. He'd come home hammered, looking to wail on somebody. So I'd provoke him so he wouldn't go after my mother and little brother.
Okay, so this is interesting. So what we have here is a self-disclosure, which is being made by the therapist, in this case, Robin Williams. And self-disclosures are real things, you know, they do happen. That being said, it really depends on the therapist whether they will be willing to do this or not. And it's not something that's usually done in a throwaway sense of the word, you know, just randomly in a conversation. It'd be quite unlikely for your therapist to drop in a self-disclosure on a spur of the moment kind of decision. It can be used as a tool. It can make you more relatable as a therapist, which can sometimes be really helpful for somebody, particularly if they feel that, you know, you're a little bit distant, perhaps, you know, they want to feel a bit more relatable. Sometimes a self-disclosure can help bridge that gap. Equally, for other people, it can actually kind of shake their confidence in you as a practitioner. I know some therapists who don't do it at all. They'll never self-disclose. They'll never reveal something about their life in that way at all, and about their past and history. And I know other practitioners who do self-disclose and will use it within the therapy setting. And for me personally, it's very, very subjective. I tend on the side of not self-disclosing. However, you know, I can see how there might be circumstances where it would make sense to do it. I can also see how there's circumstances where it wouldn't make sense to do it. Obviously, in this film, he's had a lot of previous therapy, and the relationship with the therapists aren't particularly good. You know, he doesn't really form a good relationship with them. So, you know, perhaps being a bit more relatable in this context makes sense. And obviously, in the context of the film, seems to do something good. And, you know, in this situation, obviously, he's actively inquired as to whether he has experience with it, which also casts things in a slightly different light.
Interesting nights were when he wore his rings.
Yeah, he used to just put a wrench, a stick, and a belt on the table.
See, that's quite interesting because the level of specificity with the detail where he talks about the ring there is an interesting one, because sometimes a therapist can self-disclose without meaning to self-disclose. Sometimes their knowledge is just so intimate when it comes to particular symptoms that the client may actually infer that the therapist has personal experience without the therapist coming out and saying it. And I guess there maybe are some things which, if you're really deep into a particular diagnosis, you learn about that diagnosis. And no matter kind of how professionally apt you are or how professionally screwed on you are, it can still be very difficult to get that kind of level of intimate knowledge that comes with living with symptoms on a 24-hour-a-day basis for days, weeks, months, and sometimes years. So, you know, you can't self-disclose without meaning to. That's also a possibility.
Just say choose.
Well, I gotta go with the belt there, Vanna.
I used to go with the wrench.
Why the wrench?
Because fuck him, that's why.
Your foster father.
Yeah. So, you know, what is it, like, Will has an attachment disorder? Is it all that stuff? Fear of abandonment? Is that why I broke up with Skylar?
I didn't know you had.
Yeah, I did.
You want to talk about it?
No.
Hey, Will. I don't know a lot. You see this? All this shit. fault. Look at me, son. It's not your fault.
I know.
It's not your fault.
I know.
No, you don't. It's not your fault.
I know.
It's not your fault.
All right.
Okay. So here he's saying something really, really simple. Obviously a very simple statement. It's not your fault. Now, when it comes to people experiencing psychological difficulties, there's often a lot of expectation and pressure that they've put on themselves throughout their lives. And a lot of pressure and expectation that they put on themselves not to feel certain symptoms, not to have certain symptoms, not to experience certain emotions, not to think certain thoughts. And that's what creates a crazy amount of pressure within inside somebody, and creates, long-standing tension, stress, anxiety, and emotional disharmony. And sometimes that can segue from self-blame, from self-suppression, from not experiencing what's actually occurring for somebody in the present moment. And, this scene is clearly kind of touching upon that idea. And obviously in the context of Matt Damon, otherwise known as Will, here we see Robin Williams trying to, break through some of those cycles and allow him the space to be able to actually experience what he's experiencing emotionally speaking. And obviously in this example, he repeats it, very simple statement to drive it home. And, you might have something arise within an actual therapy context that mirrors this to some degree, whether it'd be actually just directly repeating a very simple phrase like that. I'd probably lean on the side of that's quite unlikely. You probably wouldn't see that. But the idea of, validating somebody's experiences, potentially digging a little bit deeper than what somebody initially replies with, absolutely.
It's not your fault. It's not your fault. Don't fuck with me. It's not your fault.
Don't fuck with me, all right? Don't fuck with me, Sean. Not you.
It's not your fault. It's not your fault.
Okay, so we see there an example of a conflict start to emerge. We see a resistance and then a conflict, and these are two separate concepts that you might hear in relation to therapy. A resistance is often when you touch upon something meaningful to somebody or something painful for them, something that has, they do describe it as an emotional complex, perhaps. It's a series of emotions that haven't been expressed consciously. And that can then sit underlying somebody's issues, and sometimes you might touch upon that within a conversation, within a therapy dynamic, and often that can be met with resistance. It can be met with somebody not wanting to speak about that, somebody not wanting to go there, so to speak. That might be because they're not ready to go there. It might be because it feels too vulnerable, it feels too raw. But it's not unusual to find that such an area of somebody's difficulty will be resisted in terms of going there as a collaborative effort in terms of you as a therapist and them as a client. So there might be resistances, and they do occur. And obviously you see there it begins to sort of segue into a conflict of sorts. Admittedly in real life, if a client actually was to physically shove you or something like that, that would be taken and dealt with a lot more seriously perhaps than we can see in this film. But there are conflicts in therapy, there are disagreements, they do happen, and they're not always unhealthy things, they're not always bad things. Sometimes it can be good to be challenged, sometimes it can also not be good and create a rift. And so, a conflict again is a gamble. Sometimes it can pay off and sometimes it doesn't pay off. But yeah, the idea of a resistance to something, but then also a conflict arising when that box is opened, is true and is a genuine reflection of what can happen, perhaps not in dramatized fashion in this sense. The other additional point here is then we see the emotion come through. Now, in the film, it's a breakthrough of sorts, and the idea of breakthroughs, they do happen in therapy. People do have these kind of watershed moments where they suddenly realize something, realize something about themselves, realize something they've been believing about the world, realizing something in terms of the pain and the suffering of their experience. And these realizations can be quite sharp, and they can be breakthroughs where, you know, an upsurge of emotion will follow it. Especially in characters who perhaps aren't as emotionally open as a typical person, let's say. Now, breakthroughs don't always happen though. You know, people can have very good experiences with therapy and successful therapy without having a breakthrough of any kind. So if you are going into therapy, I probably wouldn't expect to have this kind of a breakthrough, but they do happen, and when they do, they tend to be quite good things on the whole, from my experience.
So sorry.
Okay, so I'm going to be honest here. There's probably no circumstance whatsoever where you'd hug a client. It's just a difference. Obviously, it's a movie. In real life, that wouldn't happen. Not any therapists I know. So, yeah, there's not too much more to say.
Fuck them, okay?
So that's that. I guess the last point on that is that, you know, people can have really intense emotional experiences in therapy, and they can sometimes look like a lot of tears, or a lot of anger, or you know, a lot of sorrow, a lot of grief. There's all sorts of emotions people can experience, and sometimes they experience them intensely, and that's certainly one of the challenges of therapy, but it can be very rewarding as well. So yeah, there's quite a few concepts there. There's obviously self-disclosure was brought into it. Then there was the idea of the breakthrough of a kind. There was also the resistance, and there was also the conflict, and then there's obviously the outpouring of intense emotion at the end there. And all of these respective things can and do occur in therapy, and they're obviously dramatized in this context, and they're shoved into kind of a 4-minute clip. You know, if you were in an actual session and somehow managed to get all of that into 4 minutes, it'd be pretty unlikely, to be honest. But, you know, these things do happen, and it's a good film. You know, it's a good film. I think it's you know, an interesting movie. It feels real. The characters feel real, and I definitely recommend going to watch it if you haven't. And hopefully I've explained a bit about, you know, some of the relation of the movie's content to real life.